The phone call came at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, in March 2024. Sarah Bennett had been awake anyway, sitting in the worn armchair by the window where she'd spent countless sleepless nights over the past 32 years. The rain tapped against the glass like fingers drumming impatiently, the way it always did in Cascade Falls, Oregon. When the phone rang, she knew before answering. There's a quality to late-night calls that carry news, a persistence in the ringing, a weight in the silence between tones. Her hand trembled as she lifted the receiver. On the other end, Detective Linda Morrison's voice was steady, but careful, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed terrible news until it sounded almost routine. "Mrs. Bennett, we need you to come down to the station. It's about Rebecca." Sarah closed her eyes. The rain continued its patient percussion. 32 years of waiting, of wondering, of that hollow ache that never quite becomes bearable, no matter what people say about time healing wounds. "You found him," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. We found him." What began on a cool October evening in 1992, when Rebecca Bennett walked 6 blocks from the Cascade Falls Community College library to her apartment and never arrived, was finally, impossibly, ending. But the truth that emerged would shatter more than one family's understanding of the past. Cascade Falls, Oregon, 1992, a timber town nestled in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains, where fog rolled down from the peaks each morning like a living thing, where the smell of pine and damp earth was so constant you forgot it was there until you left and returned. Population, 8,420. The kind of place where the Methodist Church and the Catholic Church faced each other across Main Street like patient adversaries, where the high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. The Safeway stayed open until 9. The single movie theater showed films 3 months after they premiered in Portland. The paper mill on the edge of town employed 1/3 of the working population and scented the air with sulfur on humid days. It was a good town, people said. A safe town. The kind of place where parents let their children walk home after dark, where doors remained unlocked, where trust was the currency that held the community together. Rebecca Ann Bennett was 23 years old that October, slender and dark-haired, with her father's serious grey eyes and her mother's quick laugh. She wore oversized sweaters and Doc Martens, kept a journal filled with poetry she never showed anyone, and dreamed of teaching English literature. She was in her 2nd year at the community college, working part-time at the town library, saving money to transfer to Portland State. She had a careful, methodical way of approaching life, making lists in neat handwriting, color-coding her class notes, always 10 minutes early to everything. Her apartment was a studio above the hardware store on Oak Street, 6 blocks from campus, with a window that overlooked the park where she'd played as a child. She kept plants on the windowsill, a spider plant, 2 African violets, and watered them every Sunday morning before church. Her walls were covered with postcards from museums she hoped to visit someday. The Louvre, the Prado, the British Museum. She kept her tip money in a ceramic jar shaped like an owl, a gift from her younger brother. She was careful with money, careful with trust, careful with her heart. She'd broken up with her high school boyfriend the previous spring, gently but firmly, because she knew he wanted to stay in Cascade Falls forever. And she wanted more, wanted different, wanted the kind of life that existed beyond the mountains that ringed their town like the walls of a beloved prison. October 15th, 1992, a Thursday. Rebecca had an evening class, American Literature, 1900-1945, that ended at 8:30. The professor, Dr. Helen Marsh, would later remember that Rebecca had stayed after to ask about her paper on Hemingway, that she'd been excited, animated, discussing the iceberg theory with the kind of intensity that made teaching worthwhile. Rebecca left the building at 8:50, her backpack slung over one shoulder, wearing jeans, a grey hoodie, and the red windbreaker her mother had bought her for her birthday. The walk home was simple, familiar. Down College Avenue, left on Maple, right on 3rd, then up Oak Street to the hardware store. 6 blocks, 12 minutes. She'd made that walk 100 times, 200 times, always the same route because Rebecca liked patterns, liked the comfort of routine. The evening was cool but not cold, the kind of October night that smelled like wood smoke and fallen leaves. Streetlights marked the path at regular intervals, casting circles of yellow light that barely touched each other. At 9:05, Her neighbor, Mrs. Crawford, saw her pass beneath the streetlight at the corner of 3rd and Pine. She was sure of the time because Cheers was just starting, and she always watched by the window while her husband dozed in his recliner. Rebecca was walking at her usual pace, hands in her pockets, backpack bouncing slightly with each step. Mrs. Crawford waved. Rebecca waved back, smiling. 3 blocks from home, she never made it to the 4th block. At 10:15, Sarah Bennett called the apartment. No answer. At 10:30, she called again. At 11, she called the library, the campus security office, Rebecca's 2 closest friends. No one had seen her since class ended. At 11:45, Tom Bennett drove to the apartment, knocked, used the spare key, found the place empty, the plants still on the windowsill, the bed made, everything exactly as Rebecca had left it that morning. At midnight, they called the police. Officer James Pritchard took the initial report, asking the questions parents dread answering. What was she wearing? Did she have any enemies? Any troubles at home? Any reason to run away? Sarah Bennett's voice was steady as she answered, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles were white. No troubles, no enemies. Rebecca didn't run from things. She faced them. Officer Pritchard was gentle, experienced, his grey hair and lined face inspiring confidence. He'd been with the Cascade Falls Police Department for 26 years, lived 3 streets over from the Bennetts, coached Little League with Tom back when the boys were young. He took careful notes in his neat, precise handwriting. Most missing persons turn up within 24 hours, he said, his voice kind. Usually there's a simple explanation, but his eyes, Sarah would remember later, held a different message. By dawn, the simple explanations were evaporating like the morning fog. Rebecca's car was still in her assigned spot behind the apartment building. Her purse was in her room, wallet intact, driver's license, credit cards, the $38 she'd earned in tips that week. Her journal lay open on her desk, the last entry dated that morning. Dr. Marsh loved my thesis argument, Portland State, here I come. Her toothbrush was in the bathroom. The plants needed watering. Everything suggested a person who'd intended to return home after a brief absence, who'd expected to wake up in her own bed, to continue the life she was building brick by careful brick. The Cascade Falls Police Department, all 12 officers strong, mobilized with impressive speed. Chief Robert Henley, a bear-shaped man with a reputation for thoroughness, coordinated the initial search. By Friday afternoon, volunteer teams were combing the town, calling Rebecca's name, checking yards and garages, and the dense woods that began where the town ended. Her photograph appeared on flyers stapled to telephone poles. Rebecca smiling, her graduation photo from high school, cap and gown, and that expression of determined hope that all young people wear when they believe the future is theirs for the taking. The investigation was handed to Detective James Pritchard, who'd taken the initial report. Pritchard was the department's only detective, a position he'd held for 8 years, handling the occasional burglary, domestic dispute, the drunk driving accidents that occurred with depressing regularity on the mountain roads. He approached Rebecca's case with methodical determination, interviewing everyone who'd seen her that last day, mapping her route, checking for witnesses. He worked long hours, arriving at the station before dawn, leaving after midnight, his desk covered with notes and photographs and maps with red circles marking the last confirmed sightings. He spoke with the Bennetts daily, updating them on each development, each dead end. His voice always calm, professional, carrying that quality of restrained empathy that police officers develop when they work missing persons cases. "We'll find her," he promised, and Sarah Bennett believed him because she had to believe someone. Dr. Helen Marsh described Rebecca as focused, passionate about literature, planning to apply to graduate schools. The library staff said she was reliable, never missed a shift, always returned borrowed books on time. Her friends, Melissa Chen and Amanda Rodriguez, painted a picture of a young woman who was careful but not paranoid, friendly but not naive, someone who dreamed of a bigger life but understood she'd have to work for it. She didn't do drugs, rarely drank, avoided the kind of risks that swallow young people whole. Her ex-boyfriend, David Morrison, was interviewed 3 times. He had an alibi, working the night shift at the paper mill, time cards confirmed, co-workers verified. He seemed genuinely devastated. Everyone did. Rebecca was the kind of person people rooted for, the daughter everyone wished they had, the future teacher who would have made a difference. On October 19th, 4 days after Rebecca vanished, A jogger found her backpack in Riverside Park, half hidden beneath a Douglas fir. The backpack was wet from rain but intact, the contents surprisingly undisturbed. Textbooks for her classes, the Hemingway paper she'd been working on, her class schedule, pens, a half-eaten granola bar, her student ID. Her red windbreaker was found the next day, 200 yards downstream, caught on branches where Cascade Creek narrowed before joining the river. Both discoveries were treated as crime scenes. Detective Pritchard processed them personally, photographing everything, bagging evidence with gloved hands, his face grim. The backpack and jacket were sent to the State Crime Lab in Portland. No blood, no signs of struggle, just the belongings of a vanished girl, mute witnesses to something terrible. The investigation expanded. Pritchard interviewed sex offenders in the county, all 4 of them, verified alibis, found nothing. He checked reports of suspicious vehicles, unusual behavior, anything that might explain how someone could disappear from a well-lit street in a small town where everyone watched everyone else. He reviewed similar cases from neighboring counties, looking for patterns, for connections, for any thread that might lead to Rebecca. The FBI was consulted. They sent an agent, a young woman with kind eyes who spoke with the Bennetts for 3 hours, taking notes, offering resources, explaining statistics about missing persons that Sarah couldn't bear to hear. The community rallied with the fierce protectiveness small towns display when their illusion of safety is threatened. Volunteers organized search parties every weekend, walking grid patterns through the woods, checking abandoned buildings, drainage culverts, anywhere a body might be hidden. The word body was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like smoke. Months passed. The investigation continued, but the urgency faded the way urgency always does when there are no new leads, no breaks, nothing but the grinding repetition of following up dead ends. Detective Pritchard never stopped working the case, but he had other cases now, other crimes demanding attention, other families waiting for answers. He kept Rebecca's photograph on his desk, he told Sarah Bennett during one of their increasingly brief phone calls. He thought about her every day. He wouldn't give up. He promised. The first anniversary came and went. The Bennetts held a memorial service at the Methodist Church, though Sarah refused to use the word memorial, refused to acknowledge the possibility that Rebecca might not come home. The church was full. People cried and shared memories and promised to keep hoping. Detective Pritchard attended, standing in the back, his face carrying that look of professional sympathy that never quite reaches the eyes. The town changed in small, invisible ways. Parents became more careful, more fearful. The evening classes at the community college saw enrollment drop. Young women walked in pairs after dark, clutching pepper spray and keys between their fingers like claws. The hardware store owner, Mr. Patterson, never rented Rebecca's apartment to anyone else, as though keeping it empty meant she might still come back. The spider plant died first, then the African violets, their leaves turning yellow, then brown, then falling away completely. The postcards remained on the walls, museums never visited, dreams suspended in time. Sarah Bennett aged a decade in that first year. Her dark hair went grey at the temples, then entirely grey, then white. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, stopped eating more than was necessary to survive. Tom Bennett retreated into silence, spending long hours in his workshop in the garage, building furniture no one needed, sanding wood until his hands bled. Their younger son, Michael, left for college the following fall and rarely came home, unable to bear the ghost of his sister that haunted every room, every conversation, every moment of silence. The house became a mausoleum of memory. Rebecca's childhood bedroom preserved exactly as she'd left it, her high school yearbooks and stuffed animals and swimming trophies gathering dust like relics in a shrine. Detective Pritchard continued to call every few months, always on Rebecca's birthday, always on the anniversary of her disappearance, his voice carrying the weight of unsolved cases and promises that become heavier each year. "We haven't forgotten Rebecca," he would say. "The case remains open." Sarah came to dread those calls almost as much as she needed them, the only acknowledgement that her daughter had existed, that her loss mattered to someone beyond the family that mourned her. The years accumulated like sediment, each one adding another layer of grief that hardened into something that wasn't quite acceptance, but wasn't quite hope either. 1993 became 1994, became 1995. The Soviet Union collapsed. The internet arrived. Cell phones became common. The world moved forward with relentless momentum, while Sarah Bennett remained frozen in October 1992, forever waiting for a daughter who never came home. The town slowly forgot, the way communities always forget the tragedies that don't get resolved, the mysteries that offer no closure. New families moved to Cascade Falls. New children walked the same streets. New graduates posed for photographs in front of the same high school. Life continued its patient, indifferent progression. In 2001, Detective James Pritchard retired after 35 years of service. The department threw him a party at the Elks Lodge. People gave speeches praising his dedication, his integrity, his decades of service. He gave a brief thank you, mentioning several cases he was proud of solving, thanking his colleagues and the community. He did not mention Rebecca Bennett, though her case file was among those transferred to the new detective, a young man named Robert Hayes, who'd grown up in Portland and viewed Cascade Falls as a stepping stone to bigger opportunities. Sarah Bennett attended the retirement party, though she wasn't sure why. She shook Pritchard's hand, thanked him for his years of effort, wished him well. His eyes were the same grey as Rebecca's, she noticed. He promised her one last time that he hadn't given up, that he still thought about the case, that he hoped someday there would be answers. She believed him because the alternative was unbearable. Pritchard moved to a cabin on the coast, a small place near Tillamook, where he could fish and garden and live the quiet retirement he'd earned. He visited Cascade Falls occasionally, attending funerals of old friends, stopping by the station to chat with former colleagues. He always asked about the Bennett case, always hoped for news. There never was any. The years continued their march, 2005, 2010, 2015. Tom Bennett died of a heart attack in 2016, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Michael married, had children, visited his mother dutifully but briefly, bringing grandchildren who asked innocent questions about the sad lady in the photographs. Sarah grew old in that house full of ghosts, her life measured in anniversaries and birthdays and holidays marked by absence. The world transformed around her. Smartphones, social media, streaming services, wars and elections, and technological revolutions. While she remained tethered to 1992, to a Thursday in October, to a 6-block walk that ended in nothing. In 2018, Cascade Falls received a federal grant to digitize old case files. The police department hired a records clerk, a meticulous young woman named Jennifer Wu, who approached the task with the systematic thoroughness it required. She spent 18 months scanning documents, photographing evidence, entering data into the state's cold case database. Rebecca Bennett's case was logged into the system in February 2019. Physical evidence was catalogued, including items that had been stored in the basement evidence room for decades: the backpack, the windbreaker, plastic bags containing fiber samples, soil samples, the granola bar wrapper, Rebecca's student ID. Protocol required that biological evidence from unsolved cases be submitted for DNA analysis when possible. The backpack's straps showed signs of handling. Fingerprints had been lifted in 1992, but DNA technology had advanced considerably since then. Jennifer Wu flagged the case for review. In August 2023, the Oregon State Crime Lab received funding to process backlogged cold cases. Rebecca Bennett's evidence was among 200 cases selected for analysis. A forensic technician named David Park extracted DNA from multiple sources: skin cells from the backpack straps, a hair follicle found on the windbreaker, epithelial cells from the student ID. The profiles were entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a database containing millions of genetic profiles from criminals, missing persons, and crime scenes across the country. The computer began its tireless work, comparing sequences, searching for matches, performing calculations that would have taken human analysts decades to complete manually. On February 12, 2024, the system found a match. The DNA from Rebecca Bennett's backpack matched a sample in the law enforcement database, a profile submitted during the standard processing of a retired police officer's mandatory background check. The name attached to the profile was James Edward Pritchard. Date of birth, March 3, 1941. Address, 247 Seacliff Drive, Tillamook, Oregon. The forensic technician stared at the screen for a full minute. Certain there had been an error, he ran the analysis again. The match probability was 99. 999%. He called his supervisor. The supervisor called the director. The director called the Oregon State Police. Detective Linda Morrison of the OSP Major Crimes Division received the case on February 15th, 32 years to the day after Rebecca Bennett vanished. Morrison was 53, lean and grey-haired, with 28 years of experience and a reputation for methodical, patient investigation. She read the case file 3 times before she allowed herself to process what it meant. James Pritchard, the lead investigator, the man who'd promised the family he would find their daughter, the man who'd spent months searching, interviewing, processing evidence, the man who'd likely killed Rebecca Bennett and then led the investigation into her disappearance, carefully steering it away from himself, ensuring that no one would ever suspect the helpful, dedicated detective who worked such long hours, who seemed so committed to finding the truth. Morrison spent the next 3 weeks building an airtight case. She reviewed every document from the original investigation, looking for signs of misdirection, of evidence deliberately overlooked or misinterpreted. She found them. Small things, inconsistencies. Pritchard had been alone when he'd found the backpack in Riverside Park. He'd been the only one to process that evidence. He'd eliminated several promising leads early in the investigation, determining them to be dead ends without adequate follow-up. He'd failed to properly investigate himself, despite having no alibi for the evening of October 15th. He'd claimed to be working late at the station, alone, no witnesses. Standard protocol would have required verification. None had occurred. Morrison obtained a warrant for Pritchard's property. On March 5, 2024, a tactical team from the Oregon State Police executed the warrant at dawn. Pritchard answered the door in pajamas and slippers, confusion giving way to something else. Resignation, perhaps, or relief, when Morrison identified herself and explained why they were there. He didn't resist. He didn't demand a lawyer. He stood quietly in his living room while officers searched the cabin he'd lived in for 23 years. In a locked filing cabinet in his bedroom, they found a box. In the box, wrapped in tissue paper, preserved with the care one might give a precious keepsake, they found Rebecca Bennett's journal, the one that had supposedly been in her apartment, the one Sarah Bennett had described to police, the one that had never been entered into evidence because it had vanished before investigators arrived. Pritchard had taken it, kept it, read it perhaps, during the long years of his retirement, a souvenir of the girl whose life he'd ended, whose family he'd consoled, whose case he'd pretended to solve. He confessed 3 hours into the interview. No lawyer, no resistance, just the tired voice of an old man admitting what he'd done 32 years earlier. He'd seen Rebecca walking home that October night. He'd offered her a ride. She knew him, trusted him. He was the police officer who coached Little League, who'd helped her father jumpstart his car once, whose daughter had babysat her when she was young. She'd accepted. Why wouldn't she? He'd driven past her street claiming he needed to check something at the station first. Would she mind? She'd been polite, agreeable. When she'd begun to question where they were going, he'd already driven to the woods past Riverside Park. He'd tried to assault her. She'd fought. He'd panicked. He'd strangled her to stop her screaming. He'd buried her body deep in the woods, in a location he couldn't quite remember now. The landscape had changed, 30 years of growth and decay obscuring landmarks. He'd kept the journal because, he said, he wanted to understand her, the girl he'd killed. He'd led the investigation because it had seemed the safest option, the best way to control the narrative, to ensure no one looked too closely at him. It had worked. For 32 years, it had worked. The news broke like a thunderclap in Cascade Falls. The man they'd trusted, the detective they'd relied on, the neighbor who'd attended their children's graduations and waved from his patrol car. A murderer. The betrayal was almost worse than the crime itself. People wept. Some refused to believe it. Others remembered small moments, interactions with Pritchard, and wondered how they'd missed it, what signs they'd ignored, whether trust itself was possible in a world where monsters wore familiar faces. Sarah Bennett took the news in silence. Detective Morrison delivered it in person, sitting in the same living room where Rebecca had grown up, speaking quietly, offering the truth that had taken 32 years to emerge. Sarah didn't cry. She'd used up her tears decades ago. She simply nodded, thanked Morrison, asked when she could have Rebecca's journal back. Morrison promised to return it once the trial concluded. if there was a trial. Pritchard had confessed. His attorney was negotiating a plea deal. Without the journal, without Pritchard's memory of where he'd buried her, Rebecca's remains were never found. The state deployed ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, forensic archaeologists. They searched the woods east of Riverside Park, hundreds of acres of dense forest and undergrowth. They found nothing. Rebecca was still lost, even now, even after the truth had emerged. Her body rested somewhere in the wilderness, beneath 30 years of fallen leaves and snow and the patient, indifferent growth of the forest that had reclaimed her. James Pritchard pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in October 2024. He was 83 years old, frail and liver-spotted, requiring a cane to walk into the courtroom. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would likely die there, in a cell far from the coast, far from the cabin where he'd spent his retirement, far from the town he'd betrayed so profoundly. Sarah Bennett attended the sentencing. She sat in the front row, her white hair carefully brushed, her hands folded in her lap. When the judge asked if she wanted to make a victim impact statement, she stood slowly, her voice steady but quiet. "You took my daughter," she said, looking directly at Pritchard. "But you took more than that. You took 32 years of hope. You took my husband's last years, letting him die without answers. You took my son's trust in the world. You took the community's faith in justice. And you did all of it while pretending to help us, while promising you'd find her, while we thanked you for your service." She paused, her grey eyes holding his. "I hope you live a long time in prison, Mr. Pritchard. I hope you have decades to remember what you did, to understand the magnitude of your betrayal. I hope you never know peace again." She sat down. Pritchard looked away. The town held a memorial service for Rebecca in November, 32 years after she'd vanished. The Methodist church was full again, many of the same people who'd attended the first service, older now, greyer, carrying the weight of 3 decades. But this time, the word memorial was spoken aloud, acknowledged. Rebecca was gone. She wasn't coming home. But the truth had come home, and perhaps that was enough. Sarah Bennett stood at the front of the church, Rebecca's journal in her hands. Morrison had returned it the week before, and read the last entry, the one about Portland State, about dreams of the future, about hope and determination, and the belief that hard work would lead somewhere good. Her voice broke only once. The years have continued their march. Cascade Falls endures, smaller now, the paper mill long closed. Main Street dotted with empty storefronts, the young people leaving for cities that offer more than memories. Sarah Bennett still lives in the house where Rebecca grew up, though she's converted Rebecca's room into a sewing space. Finally accepting that shrines don't honor the dead, living does. She has coffee with her grandchildren when they visit, tells them stories about their aunt, keeps her memory alive in words because it's the only way memory survives. The case files have been closed, boxed, archived. The evidence room in the basement of the Cascade Falls Police Department contains one fewer box now. The items returned to Sarah or retained by the state as evidence of Pritchard's guilt. The backpack and windbreaker were returned. Sarah couldn't bear to keep them. She donated them to the local historical society, along with the flyers and newspaper clippings and the brittle, yellowed missing person posters that had once covered every telephone pole in town. They're part of the archives now, part of the town's history, a reminder of when safety revealed itself to be an illusion and trust became a luxury no one could afford. The forest east of Riverside Park keeps its secret. Rebecca rests there still, beneath the Douglas firs and western hemlocks, beneath the ferns and swordgrass, becoming part of the earth she'd walked upon, part of the ecosystem that reclaims all things eventually. Sometimes hikers pass near where she might be, unaware they're walking past a grave, that beneath their feet lies a girl who dreamed of museums in Europe, of teaching literature to students who would love it as she had, of a life larger than the one offered by a small town in the shadow of the mountains. The trees don't care. The creek continues its patient journey toward the river. The seasons turn. The world forgets, the way it always does, the way it must, to make room for new joys and new sorrows and new stories that will someday also be forgotten. But Sarah Bennett remembers. And in a prison cell in eastern Oregon, James Pritchard remembers. And somewhere in a database, Rebecca Bennett's name remains. A data point in humanity's ongoing struggle to make sense of the senseless, to find justice in a world that rarely offers it, to believe that truth matters even when it comes too late to save anyone. The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning, and after 32 years an answer came. Not the answer anyone wanted, not closure, because closure is a myth we tell ourselves to survive grief, but truth, hard, terrible, devastating truth. And sometimes truth is all we get. Justice waited 32 years to arrive in Cascade Falls, but it arrived. Decades may bury secrets, but they cannot keep them buried forever. The truth, patient and persistent, finds its way to light eventually. Where were you when it finally did? Subscribe so that stories like Rebecca's are never forgotten, so that the weight of unsolved crimes continues to press upon us, reminding us that justice delayed is justice denied, but that even delayed justice matters, even when it comes too late, even when all it offers is the cold comfort of finally knowing.